Now we get to the part where we ask questions that are directly pertinent to what the senator just got through telling us, which I think was an extremely important statement. Our panel consists of 3 people from Brookings and 1 person who's not from Brookings. So let me just say, down on the far right is Bill Frenzel, where he's used to occupying territory. Next to him is Bill Gale, a foremost expert in taxation and a senior fellow here at Brookings. Bob Greenstein, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. He masquerades as a director, but he's the whole shot. And he has written frequently and very, I think, perceptively on this issue, and so it'll be interesting to hear what he has to say. And Alice Rivlin, who has been more involved in this debate than I think just about anybody, from the perspective of generating her own plan to commenting on others' plans and generally teaching all of us, including people here at Brookings, about what we have to do to get a budget deal. So this is a remarkable statement. I should tell the audience that several months ago, Xavier Becerra came here and for a Friday lunch, quiet session with about 30 people, and we had a very lively discussion because he proposed that Democrats should do exactly what Patty Murray just proposed. I think a lot of people in the room were incredulous at that point, but now we have it from a person who's on 5 committees in the Senate. She's head of the Senatorial Campaign Committee. So now we have to count this as a serious proposal. So the obvious first question to the panel is, would this work if we did it? Would it work? And what would the result be if we actually went off the cliff, or slope, as Bob prefers to call it? What would be the consequences for the economy and for the budget debate? Bill Frenzel.
Well, I think the part of her speech that impressed me the most was the ending, where she said she was optimistic and hoped for a deal. But the qualifier throughout the whole discussion was that it had to be a balanced deal, and as I interpreted her definition of a balanced deal was half taxes and half spending. My own guess is that isn't going to pass muster in any kind of an arrangement. Also, it seemed to me what she was calling a grand bargain, under that definition, looked like it was going to be a little thin, that it wasn't going to get us where we need to get. Simpson-Bowles, which is the standard, and Rivlin Domenici were in the $5 billion area, more or less. I think sounds like she's about halfway there. And so I think we need to escalate her aspirations a bit.
Alice, you want to say something about this? It looked like you were.
Yes, I actually think it's a very bold move on the part of the senator. When you say, will it work, it's a question of what it is. As a negotiating tactic, I think the threat to let the whole kit and caboodle expire at the end of the year is a brilliant negotiating tactic. I hope it doesn't actually happen because I think if we did that, we would take some risks with the economy. CBO, among others, has pointed out that that going off the cliff would risk recession in the first half of next year. Don't know whether that's really right, whether it's too pessimistic or maybe too optimistic. But there are real risks here. On the other hand, as a negotiating tactic, it makes sense. If you remember back when the negotiating tactic of the Republicans was, well, let's default, let's let the debt ceiling rip. That was truly scary to those of us who thought that default was an unacceptable option. But going off the cliff is risky, but it has some advantages. It would mean that the debt ceiling problem wasn't a problem, and that it would buy some time to think of a better answer, and probably not be totally catastrophic for the economy. I'm not for going off the cliff, but I think as a negotiating tactic, it makes a lot of sense.
Bill.
Gail.
Okay, so I don't think it's just a negotiating tactic. I don't think she's just playing poker. Maybe she is, but there's more to it than that, and that is 90% of the Republicans in Congress have signed the No New Taxes pledge. If I had any criticism of her speech, it was that she was referring to extreme elements in the Republican Party that didn't want to raise taxes. Well, 90% is a pretty big extreme group. It's not an extreme Republican idea to sign the No New Taxes pledge. It's a mainstream Republican idea. So the problem the Democrats have is if they want taxes to be any part of a budget deal, they have to not only negotiate with the Republicans, they have to get the Republicans to negotiate themselves so they can all hold hands and violate the No New Taxes deal at the same time. So one way to avoid that is simply to let the Bush tax cuts expire. That's 2% of GDP and revenue right there. And they can get that by doing nothing. So it's a substantive issue as well as a strategic issue. And I wouldn't want to downplay the substantive part. You can get more revenue out of a deal if you just let the tax cuts expire than if you keep extending them. In terms of the long-term effects, the way I think of it is if we let the tax cuts expire and we initiate the sequesters, we will be on a much better long-term path than we are now in terms of budget aggregates. Now, nobody will like the structure of what we've done because we will have raised tax rates instead of expanding the base, and we will have cut discretionary spending instead of addressing entitlements. But the fact that we're on a better path would give us more revenues, less spending. It would give us an opportunity to reach a budget deal, and it would, of course, give us the incentive to reach the budget deal because nobody likes that particular structure. The short-term concerns, Alice mentioned CBO said this could push us back into a recession. That could be dealt with via an explicit short-term stimulus package that did not involve the Bush tax cuts. I had a piece online about this earlier this week, but I think this partisan debate about how much of the tax cuts do we extend or how much do we not extend is not getting us anywhere. There are many more interesting issues, believe it or not, than what share of the Bush tax cuts ought to be extended. And I think the right way to do that is to deal with this is to do something explicitly short-term and temporary now, let the tax cuts expire, create the big framework, and deal with tax reform. Lastly, I want to talk about the balance issue. I didn't hear Senator Murray saying anything about explicitly 50-50. Maybe I missed it. But I don't think
you're right.
I don't think it's not my impression that 50-50 is a requirement for anybody, both because it's an arbitrary division and because there are these huge items called tax expenditures, which are really spending that happens to be embedded in the tax code. So things like the mortgage interest deduction, the charitable deduction, the deduction for state and local taxes, those could just as easily be structured as spending items. And Donald Marin at the Urban Institute and the Tax Policy Center and Eric Toder have a piece that show that the spending in tax expenditures is a good 4% of GDP. And so you could cut those things, and conservatives could call those spending cuts, and liberals can call them tax increases if they want. So I don't think the ultimate exact decomposition of the balance is that important. I think it's important that for this to be a sustainable deal, both sides have to be seen as getting something as giving up something.
Bob Greenstein.
Well, I very much agree with Bill. This really is much more than a negotiating tactic. And I can say that not just from Senator Murray's speech today. President Obama's statement last Monday that he would veto a bill that extends the upper income tax cuts, and conversations I've had with people in the White House. And I think there's history here. The history is what's happened over the last year or two. For months we had negotiations last spring and summer, and at the end of the day, we ended up with a Budget Control Act package that was 100% spending cuts and no revenues, upon the risk that if you didn't do that, the nation could default. Over the last 5 or 6 weeks, in meetings I've had with various Democratic senators and senior staff to Democratic senators, I have posed the question to them. I have said, when you go into negotiations in the lame duck, do you believe that although you'll talk about a balanced package, that Republicans enter the negotiations believing that when you get right up to January 1st, you, the Democrats, will reluctantly relent and agree to extend all of the tax cuts. And everyone who answered the question, not everyone did, but everyone who answered the question said, yes, that is what the Republicans believe. Well,
and that's what they would do, right?
That is, and from the administration and the Democratic standpoint, they heard Speaker Boehner say, what, a month or two ago, every dollar we raise the debt limit has to be offset by at least $1 in spending cuts, no revenues. The only budget that meets that is the Ryan budget. So there is now, I think, a much clearer understanding than there was a year ago in Democratic ranks, of which Senator Murray is reflecting, that if you don't somehow change the terms of the debate and show that you will not agree to any more deals that are spending cuts only, that you will just continuously go farther and farther down that path. And with regard to the economy, I think the view, which I very much share, it's reflected in a paper Chad Stone at the center has done, is that what CBO really said was that if all the tax cuts expire and stay expired, if sequestration goes into effect and remains in effect, then over the course of the first half of 2013, we're likely to slide back into a recession. My view is, just as in 1995, when Clinton and Gingrich couldn't agree and the government shut down, the pressure on both sides was so great, there was a deal in 3 weeks. The pressure here will be even greater, I believe, given the state of the economy and concern in the markets. I think if we don't have a deal by January 1st, we likely will have a deal by, say, the end of January. I wish it weren't the case, but that may be the only way to actually get a deal that includes revenue, and because it includes revenue, leads Democrats to go significantly farther than they otherwise would in areas like Medicare. One last point. To the degree that Republicans really come to believe, and I don't think they do yet, that people like the President and Senator Murray are serious, that they really will go into January if necessary. If that is widely believed, then it increases our chances of getting it done without going into January.
Absolutely. Let's just clarify one point here, a negotiating point that Alice implied, but no one has said it explicitly. I want to see if you agree with this. If we went off the cliff, and now we're in 1 January, the situation is that Republicans could agree to proposals that would produce additional revenues, and they would truly be tax cuts because the tax rates have all gone up as of 1 January, correct? And then going back to your statement, Bob, does that create a possibility that you really could get a deal that involves revenues? Because Republicans then would truly be saying these are tax cuts, and yet they're producing $1 trillion or whatever it happens to be in revenues.
I think that's a little too canned and cute. I view it a different way. As Senator Murray said, I think there are some Republicans who behind the scenes feel we need to have some revenues, we need a balanced package. It is very hard for them to get out in front on that in their party. A few have done it, but not very many. If we actually go into January, the top rate has risen to 39.6%. There is volatility in the markets, financial markets. There's tremendous concern. The media is focused on this incessantly. The president has called bipartisan round-the-clock negotiations at the White House. In that context, I think it's somewhat easier for Republicans to move. It's not this cute little technical thing. Well, it's no longer. It's the larger atmosphere.
It wouldn't be technical at that point, Bob.
But it's
It'd
the
be
larger.
real. Bill, what do you think of this? Do you think Republicans would be able to cut a deal with tax increases more easily after January 1 if the Bush tax cuts disappear?
I really don't know, Ron. I look on this. Alice says this is less worse than the Republicans threatening the debt ceiling. I think it's the same kind of an adventure. It is. This is the season when the parties are in conflict. They are throwing down their threats one to the other. I think it's a whole different game after the election. Then they got to sit down and decide what they want to do. Maybe still a stalemated game. And I think what Bob has suggested is a possibility. There might be a kick the can down the road. There might be a fall off the cliff and followed by negotiation to save oneself. But I don't think we know that. I think what we do know is that there are precious few days in a lame duck session. And the problems are sufficiently complicated that it is extremely hard to negotiate the full kind of bargain. So however it gets kicked over into 2013, a lot of the decisions are still going to be made in 2013, particularly with respect to tax reform, which will take the committees at least a year, I assume.
So let me sort through that and just ask you a yes or no question. If this
Politicians don't know those questions.
Yeah, no, but you're not a politician anymore. You're a scholar.
I've gone straight.
Yeah, okay, good. So you'll answer. All right, so now we're January 1st again, and we went over the cliff, and now it's truly the case that if we could do things that would raise revenues and still be tax cuts, and to take Bob's scenario, meanwhile, the whole country is going nuts, and the financial markets maybe, and the media is covering it incessantly. With those two factors, is it more likely the Republicans would allow some deal that would be $1 trillion or some, amount in tax increases?
Again, I don't know. If I had to guess, I'd say Bob is on the right track, and that is a possibility. But I really don't know. It seems to me that when the Republic is in chaos and the economy is going in ruins, there will be a heavy incentive for both sides to agree on something.
Yeah, I think your question is missing an important element of the discussion, where there are two aspects of the tax debate right now. One is how much revenue to raise. The other is structural reform of the tax system. Okay, if the Bush tax cuts expire, right, the revenue question is done. All right, we've just raised an enormous amount of money. That means, from the perspective of getting enough revenue to be part of at least a medium-term budget deal, a $4 trillion-ish deal, we're done. If Congress wants to continue to work on structural reform, that's great. I'd be all for that. But in terms of getting revenue into the package, simply into the deficit reduction package, simply letting the tax cuts expire does that. And so in that sense, it would make reform, I think, significantly easier, because then it would be about revenue neutral or tax cutting relative to the baseline, rather than about raising taxes.
Okay,
Yeah, as you pointed out, that is a short term, because you've not ratcheted down in that scenario any of the cost drivers in the long term.
No, that's right. Sure, it's not the whole solution, no question.
Alice.
I just want to speak up for the grand bargain, because whether going off the cliff is a negotiating tactic that results in a deal in December or a deal in January is not as important as recognizing that that's not what we want to do. We don't want to raise more revenue by raising rates when we have an opportunity to greatly improve the tax code and improve its pro-growth nature and its progressivity at the same time. And the sequester is not how we want to cut spending. Mainly because it doesn't deal with the entitlement programs, as your question to Senator Murray pointed out. If we're going to solve this problem, we've got to have a grand bargain that does comprehensive tax reform that raises revenue and slows the growth of entitlements in the future. We can't get there unless we do that. So we need some kind of forcing mechanism, and here we've got one.
Yeah. Bob Greenstein.
Well, following up on what Alice just said, excuse me, we're all saying we'd much rather this occur in November or December than January. But if we go into January, the increase in the top rate to 39.6% may be, we don't know that it will be, may be such a forcing mechanism.
Yeah.
Bill Frenzel said exactly right, that tax reform could take 6 months or a year. If current law goes into effect on January 1, and the top rate goes to 39.6%. My hunch is that that significantly increases Republican interest in tax reform because they don't want a 39.6% top rate.
Really?
The Democratic position is then, we'll work with you
Yeah.
to get a top rate significantly below 39.6 in return for enough tax expenditure closures that we get a net contribution of, hopefully somewhere in the 1.x trillion range, to deficit reduction. And if the Republicans go for that, they only go for that if in return Democrats agree to certain things in entitlements. And again, this is the optimistic scenario. If it worked, you then have a process that takes 6 months or 10 months, whatever, and you have a time frame by which the committees are to produce legislation that saves X in entitlements, raises Y in revenues, you package them together, and you have some kind of enforcement mechanism if they don't do it. But I do think that there's a somewhat better chance of actually getting there if the 39.6% actually takes effect briefly. One last point, which is I do want to be clear that if we go into January, start down the slope, I would say, rather than over the cliff, there's no way that all of the Bush tax cuts stay expired until the whole tax reform deal is done. When they work out this so-called framework agreement, they will make the bulk of the tax cuts, hopefully not the high-income ones, retroactive to January 1st.
Right.
Bill, you were dying to say something. What?
I wasn't dying to say something, but
Well, you can speak anyway.
thank you. I think there's an issue here that we should keep in mind that we've had one major tax reform in 50 years. Right? We've had one major healthcare reform, structural reform, in, I would guess, about the same amount of time. We cannot afford to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We cannot wait for the perfect tax reform or the perfect healthcare reform before we deal with medium-term budget deficits and long-term budget deficits. And that means we may have to take a deal that gets us on the right path, even if it doesn't get us the right structure, because once we're on the right path, we will have the opportunity and incentive to get on the right structure, and we'll have the money to deal with it. It means we may have to deal with the deficit before we're going to ever resolve all the issues in healthcare, certainly before we're going to resolve the issues in tax reform. And I just want to be sure that people don't have the sense that if we don't solve the entire 75-year or 150-year deficit issue, then anything short of that is a failure. All right? There is no public policy issue that we have solved 75 years out into the future. Right? And it's I think, a result of inflated expectations and inflated rhetoric to expect that we're going to solve this problem 75 years out or 100 years out in the future. So I guess my message is, let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And if we can get onto a good path but not the perfect structure, let's take it and then work from there to get to a better structure.
Alice.
I agree with that, but let me be a little more optimistic about tax reform. This may be a moment where we drop the impediments of incrementalism in tax reform, which is fatal, because then you're arguing about whose ox gets gored. This might be a moment in which we blow up the whole tax code and start over, and put in a more sensible set of provisions which would tax almost all income at the same rates, lower the rates, and reinstate only a few of the most necessary and important provisions, a child credit and a earned income credit, and a credit, not a deduction for a home mortgage. You could do that, and it is very attractive. And there are a lot of actual Republicans who think this way, and not all are in the Grover Norquist camp. If you read Tom Coburn's op-ed in, I think it's today's Times, he sounds a Republican note of hope here.
And he was even more negative about Grover Norquist than Senator Murray, I believe. Is it fair to say?
Yeah, he was.
So I realize we're mostly scholars here. We're negotiating with friends, though, but he said he's going straight, so that implies he's not a full politician anymore. So let me ask you a political question. This is really a risky strategy by Democrats. It could blow up. It could really produce some big problems for them. Are any of you concerned about that?
I
And do you
am.
agree with it?
Less risky than risking national default like the Republicans did last summer?
No, I think
I-
it's less.
well,
think
Bob,
it is
too
not-
late. It
I
worked.
think it is similar to that,
don't think
which
it's-
Oh, I
was a
don't-
Okay,
high
you'll
risk.
get a
Not-
chance just a
not
minute.
similar
Go
at
ahead,
all.
Bill, go ahead.
I think that was a high risk, maybe a worse risk, but this is a very high risk too. It's high risk for the economy, plus it's high risk, I think, for the Democrat Party. They got a lot of interests involved in that tax code. They've got AMT going after their people. They'll lose their child credit. They lose their 10% rate. They lose a hell of a lot of things they like to have, and they like growth in the tax system too, just just the way Republicans do. So, yeah, I think it's high risk, and I tend to look at it as a before the election kind of threat or challenge to the Republicans. And I think you get the same thing back from the Republicans. I think it's a whole new game after the election day.
Bill Gale's not dying to say something, but he can anyway.
I think it's a competing risk issue, not a high risk. The risk, the Democrats have seen the risk of going to the table and negotiating. What they got out of it in the debt deal was an all spending cut deal, which wasn't even predominantly entitlements, it was discretionary. They're not happy with that strategy, with that outcome. They want the government to beef up its revenue structure in the long term. The only way to do that I see is to let the tax cuts expire. I can't believe that the Republicans, again, 90% of whom have signed the No New Taxes pledge, I can't believe that they're going to defect en masse, even if, despite what Coburn wrote. So there's one risk is that we just never get enough revenue to deal with the long-term fiscal issue. Another risk, which would be incredibly damaging to the economy, and another risk is that we hurt the economy in the short term. And I think it sounds to me like what they're trying to do is say we're going to take the second risk, and the argument may be that we could get some stimulus short term that's not related to the Bush tax cuts, and we're going to try to move forward on the revenue aspect of the long-term fiscal solution. That seems to me like a choice, balancing one risk against another. But no matter what you do right now, you're facing risk.
Bob.
Look, you have to ask yourself the question. If we had defaulted last August and maybe 3 or 4 weeks later come up with a plan, would that have caused no more damage to the economy than if we go into January, come up with a plan in late January that's retroactive to January 1st? Every person I've asked that question to says it ain't remotely close. That once you default, you do permanent damage to the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. The reason that going over the cliff causes damage to the economy is because of all the aggregate demand it pulls out of a weak economy. You don't pull that much aggregate demand out in the first few weeks. And as I've said, any deal will make most things retroactive to January 1st. Yes, it would create uncertainty in the markets. So I've asked a number of New York Wall Street types about this. What they generally tell me is you would get volatility, interest rates might go up, who knows, 50, 60 basis points temporarily, but if you then got the deal, that would fade away. And what's very striking is the paper put out by the Carlyle Group. You can't get much more establishment than the Carlyle Group. And they basically say, yeah, there's a risk of going into January, but the bigger risk to the economy is kicking the whole can down the road and not addressing the deficits at all. On the tax reform issue, I think this is a challenge and a risk to both parties. Everybody talks a good game on tax expenditures. I mean, Coburn's piece this morning So he mentioned ethanol, and I forget the second. They were both really tiny, right?
Yeah. We got about $1.
You know, it's very striking that all these plans, big like Ryan, Romney, Toomey, others, cut tax rates and pay for it with tax expenditures. They have one thing in common. They only have one specific on tax expenditures, and that's to take capital gains and dividend rates off the table, which then makes it impossible to pay for the big tax cuts unless you end up doing a net increase on taxes in the middle. So I think a big challenge for both parties, not just Republicans, is if you have some framework in which you're going to achieve X in increased revenue for deficit reduction, but you're going to lower the top rate, and you actually then get into the Finance and Ways and Means committees and look at what you have to do to mortgage and charitable and the employer health exclusion and the like, do they have the gumption to do it? I don't know. I'm worried about that, and frankly, it's why my recommendation is not to lock in up front what the maximum top rate would be. Just lock in your revenue number and say, the more you're willing to close tax expenditures, the more you lower the rate. But I worry that a deal that locks in the maximum top rate and gives you a revenue number, that those two numbers conflict when the policymakers confront the specific choices, 401ks, and I worry that if that occurs, the revenue number gives way and we don't actually get the deficit.
You're right to worry, but let me say in defense of Senator Coburn, he signed Simpson-Bowles, which had a full-fledged tax reform that did all of the things you say.
But it was purely illustrative.
Well, it may have been illustrative, but the point is such plans do exist, and some Republicans are for them.
I don't think either party, I don't want to just single out the Republicans here, I don't think you could get a majority of either party on the Hill to vote for the illustrative tax reform plan in Bowles-Simpson. I think it's a terrific plan. I'm all for it, but I'd be amazed if you could
I'd
move
be
it.
amazed too, but I'm just suggesting that we may be in a different environment with respect to taxes, which is less incremental than it used to be.
I agree with
The perfect example, though, of coming back to letting the tax cuts expire. Letting the tax cuts expire would raise more revenue than Bowles-Simpson would generate.
But not in as good a way.
No, it's got a structural issue. But what you want to do is get
all the tax cuts, not just the high income tax.
Yeah, the current law baseline, which lets all the tax cuts expire, would raise more revenue than the Bowles-Simpson plan did. So my sense is it would be easier to get to a Bowles-Simpson outcome, if that's what you wanted, by letting the tax cuts expire and then saying, gee, we got a lot of money and we don't like the structure, so let's reform, let's cut taxes and overall and get down to Bowles-Simpson.
That's what I said,
that's going to be more.
Bob Greentine said it was naive.
Well,
I don't think the policymakers are going to let all of the tax cuts stay expired.
Let me just finish the point. The point is that if you start from there, from the expired tax cuts, you have more revenue and you have a structure that a lot of people don't like. You have an incentive to make a change to Bowles-Simpson. If you make a change to Bowles-Simpson now, that would be scored as a revenue increase, and plus you'd be killing a lot of people's tax expenditures, so you'd face a double whammy. So I think the strategy here matters a lot.
I really hate to think we get driven to responsible tax reform by by falling off the cliff. But maybe it is a...
As opposed to
maybe
we don't get driven to responsible tax reform by falling off the cliff? Or
maybe it's the incentive that some of them need. I would like to think that the Congress could, and the President could move jointly into tax reform.
You're a former member of Congress. What does it mean to you that 90% of Republicans have signed in their new taxes pledge?
Well, I think they haven't got much guts.
Thank you. Okay, so how do you get to tax reform from the current system then? How do you get around that constraint?
I don't know how many have signed it, but I understand, as Alice does, that there are a number who are willing to discuss putting revenues into any kind of a grand conclusion, and I'm with her. I think that eventually it is going to happen, but I hate to see us thrown off the cliff have it happen. And I noticed that a couple of people here mentioned that if we got thrown off the cliff and took, what the CBO say, it costs us 1.5% of
Yeah,
GDP
I think it's 1.4 or 1.3%.
Yeah,
But in the second 6 months, it increases more than it increases in the first 6 months. So I mean, that's
okay.
people
But
ought
it's
to take that into
pretty
account.
tough 6 months.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
somebody said, well, it's possible we could have some stimulus programs. Now I can't imagine that if they couldn't agree on the cliff problems, that they would agree on a stimulus question. I think that's pretty much out of the question.
Let's go to the audience now. Raise your hand. Tell us your name. Don't make a statement. Ask a question so we can get more questions in. Are you going to have to come up here? Go ahead.
Thanks very much. I'm Garrett Mitchell, and I write the Mitchell Report, and I want to ask this group of economists, including Dr. Haskins, a political question. And that is, if we define best of all worlds as some sort of deal in December or the early part of January, followed by some substantive tax reform over the course of the next 6 to 12 months, what political configuration do you think creates the greatest likelihood that either or both of those could get done? Status quo, meaning Obama's back in the White House and Republicans have the House and Democrats have the Senate, Romney in the White House and status quo in the Congress, a Republican sweep, a Democratic sweep. Is there something to be said, and I would add to this, that the reporting that I've been doing and seeing is that virtually all of the new recruits, Republican recruits running for Congress, are not signing the pledge, which I think is an interesting thing. So anyway, just wondered.
This is a great question. So what do you think? Alice Rivlin.
I think sweeps are not in our interest at this moment, that we must have a bipartisan deal, and the chances of getting one are greater either with the status quo or with some other configuration that gives both parties a say in the deal.
Since you include me, I can answer.
I think you just get everything extended until the new Congress comes in and President Romney takes office. And then you have a budget resolution and a reconciliation bill. And the reconciliation bill has deep spending cuts and deep tax cuts. And actually, Romney might then be forced to actually move forward with his, in my view, deeply irresponsible rate cuts, which are also in the Ryan budget. So I think the whole thing we're talking about it really implies mixed government. And in a most likely scenario, something kind of like the current configuration. One other point, you mentioned something which we've all been saying. Bill Frenzel first said that you can't do tax reform up front. You'd have a process with tax reform. I just want to make the point that in some of the entitlement areas, particularly healthcare, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, the same is true. Right. The weakness of the Bowles-Simpson plan, in my view, is some of the specific Medicare Social Security proposals have serious problems in them and actually injure people in the lower part of the scale, which Bowles and Simpson didn't want to do. And they were kind of illustrative, thrown together at the end of the day. For a variety of reasons, I think the optimal package is at the same point that you have X months to produce tax reform, on a parallel track, you do the entitlement changes. You have targets for them too. Not only is that likely to get better designed entitlement changes, but I think we should remember that what we really want is to knit the entitlement and the revenue pieces together. So the Republicans don't get the entitlement cuts unless the tax cuts pass. The Democrats don't get the tax increases pass. The Democrats don't get the revenue increases unless the entitlement changes pass.
Yes.
And
Do either
you
of the bills
enact them
wanna add
both
to
at the
this?
same time.
I'd like to say that I hate to find myself agreeing with Bob. I think it's going to tarnish my reputation. But I think he's dead right. I think that taxes and entitlements have got to walk hand in hand. They are the whole essence of the problem. Democrats defending entitlements, Republicans defending no tax increases. Whatever has to be done, they have to be done together. With respect to the answer to the question, I'm with Alice and Ron. I believe that we're going to have a divided government. No way the Republicans can win everything plus 13 seats in the Senate, that's the best way. We still have to have both parties. In this country, you've never been able to do much unless you have both parties cooperating at least minimally.
So I think this is a really interesting question of whether divided government or unified government is more likely to reach the outcome. And the argument in favor of divided government is basically, it's been mentioned, that each side is going to have to do things that are odious to their own constituency, and they can hence blame the other side for those items. But it's interesting to think about unified government and whether that would work. The attractive thing about unified government is there's accountability, and somebody is responsible for this. And if the Republicans sweep the White House and the Congress, then they got to do something about it. If you look at countries like that have parliamentary systems, they're generally more adept at dealing with these issues than we are, precisely because there's some parties in charge and they're responsible, and if they screw it up, they get voted out. And so I don't know. I think mainly what it takes is policymakers that want to act like adults and solve the problem. And I'm not sure whether that's bipartisan or
Next question. It's all the way on the end over there. Go back about 4 rows and all the way on the, okay.
Ed Keene from the Observatory Group. It's a question for Mr. Greenstein, but others can also answer it too. What I'd like to hear your thoughts about is whether the Senate Democratic leadership could keep all of their members in line, say, come December. Particularly, I'm thinking of Senate Democrats from red states who might be up for re-election in 2014 to essentially agree to allow the cliff to expire. Then they'd have to go home and then tell their constituents, well, your taxes are going up, but don't worry, we'll fix this. And I'd like to hear the other end of that conversation from the constituents. And would in particular would moderate Democrats from red-leaning states, I know what Senator Murray said, but I'm wondering about the moderate Democrats from red-leaning states who might be up for re-election in 2014, whether they would agree to that.
Well, I think there's two aspects. I mean, first off, there's an issue for both parties, right? So, the Republicans go home and the question can be, why did you block, this is the line Senator Murray advanced, why did you block the extension of the middle-class tax cuts just so people at the top could have an average tax cut of whatever number of thousands of dollars a year? So there's a line, you can see the script of what each party's line would be and trying to blame the other. Do I think there would be some Democrats who would be nervous about that? Yes. I'm not sure that the number doesn't go down after the election. I mean, you have some people who may be nervous before November 6th more than they're nervous after. Either they won or they lost, but in either case, it's not as big a risk to them after November 6th as it is before November 6th. In any event, I think the question would have a bigger relevance if the Democrats had the potential, if they held on to every vote, to actually passing their proposal. But of course, they don't, because it'll take 60 votes. So I neither see the Democrats in the Senate able to get 60 votes for extending the middle-class tax cuts without the upper income, nor do I see the Republicans able to get 60 votes for extending all of the tax cuts. So I don't think anything passes the Senate. The final point, of course, is that if so many Democrats got nervous, that what the House passed then got 60 votes in the Senate, the president would veto it, as he said last Monday, and he'd clearly have 1/3 and plus some margin in both houses. So I don't think that that factor actually interferes with this approach and this strategy. And what it underscores is basically, in the absence of a bipartisan deal, you can't pass anything in the Senate on this front.
One more question. Right there.
Joe Blue. My understanding is that the fiscal cliff would not completely eliminate the deficit in 2013. And if it didn't, then we're going to hit the debt ceiling that year at some point, later on, but at some point, in which case it brings back the dynamics of the Republicans negotiating over another extension. And we didn't really comment on that a whole lot. I was wondering your thoughts. And specifically whether or not the Democrats are prepared to watch the Republicans try to drive the country over that much bigger cliff.
Bill, you're smiling the most, so you get to go first.
No, I just go, please. After you.
I like your smile better than mine. I have no idea. I just hope that the Republicans who think it's a good idea to fuss with the debt ceiling will mature a bit over the years and have learned something from their experiences in the past. That's not a good way to enforce any kind of economic or budget discipline. You're dealing with the full faith and credit of the United States, and nobody should want to see that even threatened.
Bob.
Well, if and when there is an initial bipartisan framework deal, whether it be, as we all hope, but don't think is that likely, in December, whether it's in January, it's hard to believe that such a deal wouldn't have a modest term extension of the debt limit. What I think is most likely is that we've all been talking about the fact that that first bill is a framework bill, and then you have tax reform and potentially entitlement changes that are to be produced by a date certain later in 2013. My guess is that the debt limit as part of the first framework bill is extended so it expires at about the same time you're supposed to pass the entitlement and tax changes. And then if Congress fails to make good on those, you're heading up to hit another debt limit. If you actually make good on those, and the legislation that raises revenue and reduces projected entitlement spending is moving forward sometime later in 2013, presumably that legislation has another extension of the debt limit in it. But I think ultimately the debt limit gets tied into all of these other things and is not totally divorced from them.
Bill Frenzel, if you don't want Bob Grudenstein to have the last word, you better speak up right now.
No, Bob's words have been pretty good today, way above average.
Yeah, well. Well, join me in thanking the members of the panel.